I think whether Australia ends up hosting a UN climate conference or not is kind of beside the point. Egypt hosted it last year. UAE is hosting it this year. If you host the COP, you're not kind of the moral arbiter of climate change. It's pretty greenwashy. But domestically in Australia, we need to find every single opportunity we can to highlight Australia's fossil fuel expansion.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and the Albanese Labor government has been campaigning for Australia to host the United Nations climate conference known as COP31 in 2026. And to boost Australia's credibility, they've also been aiming to host the COP with a Pacific Island nation.
Australia to launch a bid to host COP31.
Australia will seek to co-host the bid with the Pacific to help elevate the case for the region.
This is an opportunity, will be an opportunity if we win the bid, to show Australia's capacity to help the world as a renewable energy powerhouse.
The island nations' support for our bid.
Are we a renewables leader, and should we be hosting the next COP Climate Fest?
No.
The Pacific Island countries are very much at the front line of this climate crisis.
Islands that are disappearing.
It's still not regarded fully as a security matter, a life and death situation.
Here of global boiling has arrived.
In Canada's worst fire season on record.
Turning now to the latest on the devastating wildfires in Hawaii.
The deadliest wildfire in modern U.S. history.
We lost everything, our fields, our homes.
California is tonight facing an extraordinary weather event, the likes of which the state hasn't seen in more than 80 years.
The problem? Pacific Island nations aren't exactly huge fans of Australia's track record on climate policy and our expanding fossil fuel industry in particular. Climate and Energy Minister Chris Bowen visited Fiji recently, and Australia's bid to host COP31 was on the agenda. But things didn't exactly go as the minister had planned. And to tell us all about it, I'm joined by the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program Director, Polly Hemming. G'day, Polly.
G'day, Em.
So, Polly, what was the reason for Chris Bowen's visit to Fiji last week?
Well, he was in Fiji for an event that was convened by the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in partnership with the Fijian government. So he was already there. There was an event called the Pacific Small Island Developing States High-Level Dialogue on Climate Change, and that was to discuss a range of things, including, how Australia and the Pacific were going to respond to COP28, which is the UN climate conference happening at the end of this year. Then on Monday, Minister Bowen released a media release that said that he was convening another meeting, which was a roundtable with climate change ministers while he was in Fiji. And that meeting was sort of announced at the last minute. It's quite odd to announce a meeting on a Monday, the Wednesday before you're planning on having it.
Governments normally work a bit slower than that.
Slightly slower. So it was sort of a flash meeting. And the media release said it was to discuss, and I'm quoting, strengthen cooperation on climate action and ensuring the region can maximise the opportunities of the clean energy transformation, which doesn't mean much. Then it said, and to begin developing a shared approach to international climate engagement with Pacific counterparts, whatever that means. But there was also a line in it that said, and we will be discussing Australia's bid for the Pacific to host a COP. And so it was kind of clear that after 2 days of what had already been climate dialogue in this vein, that COP31 was kind of going to be the focus of this meeting. It seemed kind of obvious that that's where the focus was going to lie, even though the language is around all these other things like shared engagement and things like that.
And people might have seen the headlines from last week, but the minister didn't exactly get the reception that he was expecting, certainly from the Pacific community on the Wednesday that he was in Fiji.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to know what the Pacific leaders in the room themselves were thinking and talking about. We're not privy to that, but former leaders from the Pacific region and members of civil society made their concerns very well known. There was an ad in the Fiji Times on Wednesday morning, the day of the meeting, that basically said, Australia's promised to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Pacific. So far, all they've done is continue to approve new fossil fuels, the things that are driving the climate crisis, that are putting us at, I can read the text of the ad, but that was kind of the gist of it. Why must the Pacific now be in such a rush to do what Australia wants? That was an ad by a group called the Pacific Elders' Voice, which is an alliance of former Pacific Island leaders and former presidents of Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, among others. And so they've got clout in the region. People listen when they say something. They also put out a statement that essentially said, well, Australia hosting the UN Climate Conference in 2026 is an opportunity, but we're not seeing any action, and we've been calling for climate action from Australia for years, and they haven't listened, yet we are now expected to, or our leaders are expected to rush and do what Australia wants, basically. And there was also a media release from the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network. It's a civil society group, climate action movement.
And what did they say? They
said, again, to be fair, it's very diplomatic, that recognition that this could be a chance to elevate, the situation in the Pacific and how dire climate change is. It's a good opportunity to elevate those voices. But again, they said, why should we be in such a hurry to do what Australia wants? And really importantly, they said, we urge Pacific leaders to leverage Australia's eagerness, was the word they used, which is essentially desperation. And that's a really good point. Australia has been oddly eager to lock in support from Pacific countries to host this climate event. They've been go slow on everything else, but this is something that seems to have to be bedded down. And so that statement by Pekan was saying, we urge our leaders not to rush into this and maybe just wait until, say, after the G20 summit, which is just in a week, actually.
Not that long.
And see what Australia brings to the table there before they can be considered a credible co-host. So it was actually really sound advice.
Yeah.
Because what it will do is to provide a focus on the very real threat that climate change has to our Pacific Island neighbours.
This is an opportunity, of course, for Australia to remind the world that we're back. We're back at the international table.
Do what we said we'd do, which is to put more energy and more resources into the Pacific and to be very clear about our level of ambition on climate.
I know the Australia Institute has been critical or at least concerned about this bid to host a COP. What are some of the concerns that you've outlined in the research that we've released, Polly?
Well, the concerns have kind of, I suppose, been twofold. They've been concerns from us representing Australians, and of course our research shows that we subsidise fossil fuels to the tune of $11 billion every year. We are continuing to approve new gas and coal projects well into the middle of this century. That there are over 100 new gas and coal projects listed as in development that would result in an additional 1.7 billion tonnes of emissions, which is the equivalent of Russia's entire annual emissions. So we've come at it from that angle, but we've also highlighted what Pacific Island leaders, current and past, have already asked Australia for when it comes to fossil fuels and climate action. So Anote Tong, the former president of Kiribati, has been calling on Australia since about 2015, along with other leaders, to phase out coal production. We hosted a webinar with Seve Painu, the finance minister from Tuvalu, and Ralph Regenvanu, the climate change minister from Vanuatu, have been very clear in what they expect from Australia generally, and when it comes to partnering to host a COP, that have said, is Australia really a credible host? Why should we host an event when they've ignored our requests for years?
We are actually living the effect of sea level rise and climate change. Our land is constantly being eaten away. There are islands that are disappearing or being submerged. Our food and water security is being threatened.
Main security threat to the Pacific, and that's a clear point where we diverge from Australia in terms of what we think is security. Australia is our partner of choice. There needs to be a lot more done on climate policy and approaches to security to make us closer.
So the Australia Institute's concerns are both at a domestic level, but we're also highlighting the concerns of others. We're not representative in any way of any Pacific country, but they've made their expectations pretty clear.
Extremely clear.
That 6 Pacific countries issued the Port Vila Call, which was for a fossil fuel-free Pacific, and that's a very comprehensive document. But basically, it's saying that there needs to be no new approvals for gas and coal projects, an end to subsidies, and adequate finance for a clean energy transition in the Pacific itself.
You've mentioned that the government seems to be in a hurry on this. How much time does Labor have to convince the Pacific Islands, and are the Pacific still interested and entertaining this prospect?
Yeah, it's really quite extraordinary that the Australian government does seem in such a rush to bed this down. I think there's probably a few reasons because, I mean, if I can compare it to the safeguard debate in Australia, just for a moment, the federal government was very keen to rush that legislation through, and the sense of urgency was entirely confected by the government and the gas industry. There was really no need to rush that, all those changes through Parliament and rush the debate through. And of course, we saw that by rushing it through, it was a way for the government to carry on business as usual. So I think there's an element of that. After the Australian government won the 2022 election, I should say Labor won the 2022 election, there was a meeting with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and Pacific leaders did express support for Australia co-hosting COP31 with the Pacific countries. 12 months later, a lot has happened, none of it very good when it comes to climate or fossil fuel expansion. So going back to what I was, that comparison with the safeguard, I think the quicker Australia locks this in, the harder it is for Pacific countries to renege when Australia continues doing
expanding
not
its
very good
fossil fuel industry.
things. Yeah, so if you've got a public declaration and an official declaration, so really it's that public official support that Australia needs.
No new coal. No new coal and gas.
Must phase out coal by 2030.
Call for a fossil fuel-free Pacific.
I mean, I'm no master negotiator, but it seems to me like it would be harder to get the Australian government to commit to reining in fossil fuels and doing any number of things to put us on the right track with reducing emissions after we've got the COP than like before, when they really want it and they really want everyone to sign up to it. Seems like the appropriate time to be making some demands and seeing, what they're willing to do to prove that they really want to host this COP.
Yeah, I would have thought so. Similarly, I'm no master negotiator. You can ask my kids that. But yeah, if Australia's made itself vulnerable, by saying it wants to host this UN climate conference at all, and then by saying, and we'd also like the support of the Pacific and to do it with them. So it's vulnerable across two fronts. The Pacific currently has a lot of geopolitical leverage. So
and it carries a lot of moral weight
yes,
one of the early victims of climate change.
Yeah, it absolutely has the moral imperative. So, of course, these are sovereign nations that will act, rightly so in their own interests and in what is best for them. Either way, Australia is now exposed, whether Pacific countries choose to support the bid or not. And, I'm indifferent either way. All our research has highlighted we've raised the question as why is Australia a credible host for an event that's meant to raise climate ambition, and we've elevated what is already being said by Pacific leaders. Australia is very, very good at diplomacy. And the thing about Australia's relationship with Pacific countries is that it's not just about climate change. You know, this isn't kind of an inextricably linked relationship. It involves aid, you know, defence, security, climate finance. So it's not as simple as just saying, you know, there's a lot of things being negotiated. It's a moving feast. And one thing I'll note is that I was looking at grants.gov, the Australian government's grants website the other day, and earlier in the year, the Australian government announced what is called, I think it's the Pacific Sports Diplomacy Fund, which is $600,000, and individual grants have been given to kind of all the countries that Australia is trying to get support from for the COP, and this is not all of it, but, you know, things like the hockey teams, rugby teams, you know, Olympic preparation. And that's relevant because it shows that while these grants are kind of, and the government even calls them like low risk, low value grants, but they're actually not if you don't already have a hockey team in your country. And sport is such a huge part of all our cultures. So if I was going to be incredibly cynical, I'd say Australia might be sweetening the deal for countries, or it might be, I don't know what's happening behind closed doors. But it's not as simple, I don't think, for Pacific countries to say one way or the other, yes or no, we're not going to support it, because there's a whole lot of other things on the table, like
that
rugby
are tied
teams.
to it.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is we're back to approving coal mines, expanding gas production and opening up the NT to fracking. So we really need to host a COP to restore our reputation and look like climate leaders.
So for people out there who don't really tune into things like COP31 and who's going to host it and those kinds of things, what's the takeaway message that you would want people to kind of leave with?
I think whether Australia ends up hosting a UN climate conference or not is kind of beside the point. That we know that Egypt hosted it last year, UAE is hosting it this year. It's not kind of, if you host the COP, you're not kind of the moral arbiter of climate change. It's pretty greenwashy. But if we want to move the dial at all on Australia's commitment to fossil fuel expansion, and it runs deep, and it's been running deep for decades, then we need to be putting as much pressure on the government as possible, whether that's internally or externally. And you know, Australia hosting the COP has been described as Australia's Olympic moment on climate action. And, you know, we've said before how that's played out with the Olympics in the past. But if we preemptively congratulate Australia for hosting an event like this, then all that leverage, all that pressure just dissolves, and Australia kind of has well, I can't see anything changing, going back to that, you know, being master negotiating. If you're not putting pressure on someone, if you're not making big asks, what it comes down to is fossil fuels. And that sounds abstract, but it's not. And domestically in Australia, we need to find every single opportunity we can to highlight Australia's fossil fuel expansion and put pressure on the Australian government, domestically as voters, externally in other countries. External scrutiny on what Australia is doing is critical. Australia is a master at diplomacy. It is a master at greenwash.
It's a master at weakening ambition at UN climate conferences.
It's a master of obstruction. It's a master of securing markets for its gas and coal. The COP is just, like you said, Australia may or may not host a COP. Ultimately, that doesn't really matter. It's using these opportunities, whether it's the G20, the COP, COP28, all these events, to just highlight exactly what Australia is doing and trying to counter some of that rhetoric that Australia is bringing to the international stage.
Because ultimately we're not going to be fixing climate change by opening new gas fields and coal mines, Polly.
No, we're not.
Thanks, Polly. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 30th of September 2023, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including our report, A Fair COP. And we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Polly is at Polly J Hemming, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to check out our webinar series and our upcoming webinar with world-renowned economist Isabella Weber on Thursday, the 7th of September, to talk about why we've been thinking about inflation all wrong. Thanks for listening.